The rescue call came in thin and patient, a voice that kept to the edges of the band as if it did not want to trouble anyone. It named a location the way a mirage names water, precise but without weight. Late season in the Namib can turn even good maps into rumors. The southwesterlies farm the dunes into clean lines by afternoon and erase them by evening, and the fog that crawls inland before dawn can leave the sand tasting like a shy coastline. I was on rotation for desert responses and already had the pack stacked in the order that keeps mistakes small. Harness sat folded under the top flap, though I did not expect to tie into anything. Old habits from cliff work travel with a person even when the cliffs are made of moving granules. Sand stakes rode in the side sleeve, flagging rolled tight, satphone nestled in a pouch I could find while walking, flare kit in an outer pocket, because if you need light in this place, you need it now. My altimeter watch ticked at my wrist with a kind of ceremonial confidence that the sky did not always deserve. Orders were simple: confirm, locate, stabilize, extract if safe. That list leaves a lot of weather between its commas. I parked where hardpan let the tires answer back and killed the engine to see if the wind had a mood I could live with. The late season light was the kind that shortcuts to noon and then lingers there with cruel patience. I walked a circuit around the truck to wake my feet to the surface and let the wind show me its direction twice. The dunes told one story and the small chop of ripples told another. The first anomaly was nothing dramatic, just a disagreement in the sand's handwriting. The taller backs wore a slant that argued for a long push out of the ocean, but the ripples at my boots had been laid by a breath coming from inland. Wind can braid itself, but the distance between the big and the small is not usually that sharp. I noted it the way a person notes a pebble in a shoe, not painful yet, but promising to become. I set a line of flags from the truck's tailgate toward the first low saddle, pinning each with a stake sunk to the webbing. A person can think clearly with a path behind them, even if they never use it. The mind likes the idea of retreat. The pack rode close to my spine and the satphone blinked its small signal bravado at the empty blue. I radioed a standard departure call, kept the voice level, read off the plan to follow the lee of the long dune, climb at the cut, and scout the basin beyond for any sign of the caller. The channel tasted busy with static, but not the usual scratch of ground glass. This had a smoother hiss under it, as if something brushed a page. The second anomaly belonged to the ear. I do not like when the desert sounds like paper. Walking the lower line let me feel where the sand had crusted overnight. A heel test would hold for 1, maybe 2 steps. Then a soft give warned me to widen my stance and keep my hips loose. The altimeter watch ignored all that and held steady like a metronome that only knows one song. I used it anyway because tools teach the hands even when they lie to the face. The smell carried almost nothing at first. Then a brief suggestion of cold kelp. Wrong by this far inland. The Benguela can push its breath far, they say, but this felt too far and too sharp, like a letter delivered to the wrong address. I crested at the saddle and paused, letting breath slow and the pack settle. The basin beyond looked like a bowl someone had set crooked on a table. The dune faces leaned in disagreement, creating a corridor that ran longer than the map remembered. I keyed the radio and spoke the courtesy line we use when we don't know if the person is listening or imagining the help. Name, intent, approach, request for any movement, any reflective cloth, any sound within reason. The wind answered with a low thread that did not belong to its direction. It was like speaking across a hall and hearing the reply from behind, a slight mismatch in arrival that made the body want to turn. I was alone. Above me the sky held to its rehearsal of heat. I dropped into the bowl using the side step that keeps knees honest and flagged again at the floor. Not because I feared being swallowed, but because the view at ground level changes what a person thinks about distance. The satphone bars rose as if encouraged, and then fell as if embarrassed. No high terrain to explain the mood. I checked the antenna for a loose seat, pinched the connector with a gloved hand, and held the unit against my chest to warm it. It pulsed back with that same strange confidence. The radio gave me the paper sound again. I turned my head so the mic lay out of the wind and said the name from the call record, slow and steady, told them I was in the basin south of the mark, told them I would light a flare low in the lee and asked for any sign they had seen it. I set the flare in the sand where its shadow matched the direction of the breeze I felt on my face. The smoke's first lift went sideways in the other direction. I watched it without moving, counting by breath until the line straightened toward the ocean, and then, briefly, toward the inland ridge before the column settled into something that could be called acceptable. I kept the flare tube to mark where I had started, and moved along the corridor, careful with stride length, because the desert teaches arithmetic in the souls, and I like to pass the test. A bird cut the sky then, too high to be useful, and yet it felt important that anything lived above this noise. I found the first human print near the base of a slip face, not quite fresh, but not long set either. The edges softened, and then sharpened again like a thought revised. It did not match the weight a single traveler would carry in this heat. It read lighter, and then heavier within a few paces. That could be a limp, a pack shifted, a person stopping to listen. Or it could be nothing, just the sand's mood. I put my palm into the impression and felt a cool underlayer that should have taken longer to find. My routine says fix the bearing with 3 cues and then commit. The map gave me one, the dune line tried to give me another, and the wind was trying to make a mockery of both. I let the altimeter watch have its say, even though pressure games in this kind of heat whisper lies, and found a curve in the basin wall that made sense if someone had been walking to punch the shortest path between 2 crests. I laid a short run of flags toward that curve and stopped where a thin rasp moved under the wind, like the voice from the call had set itself down in the sand and kept talking. It had a rhythm a person could mistake for speech if they wanted to be comforted. I did not. I crouched and planted a stake, toggled the radio to a quieter channel, and tried a direct ping on the satphone to the repeaters we sometimes borrow when the desert pretends to be a blank. The handset answered back with an agile little tone as if it were indoors, then dropped to sulking silence. When I lifted my head, the wind pressed at my right ear and the sand streamers along the slope ran left. I spoke the caller's name again and described a piece of cloth I carried, told them I would tie it high on my rescue pole and raise it above the crest. I said if they saw a color that did not belong to the place, they should do whatever simple motion they could manage and hold it until I affirmed. The wind answered from where it should not be, a soft incorrectness, and my own voice came back a beat late as if the dunes had learned to work with a canyon's tricks. Orders would have me circle wide and call for a second unit before committing to a narrow approach, and any student who looked at this geometry would write the same. But the corridor had taken on the feeling of a ledger, with marks that did not belong to the weather alone. The flare smoke had remembered its confusion. The satphone performed confidence like a bad actor. The radio liked paper. The first print carried a cool underlayer. None of these were disasters alone. Together they turned the page. I went to my knee beside the next stake and told the channel I was advancing a short distance to verify a visual, that I would maintain flag line, that I would report every few breaths. I touched the watch as if to make it tell the truth, and stepped closer to the curve where the wind answered wrong. The sand there had been worried by small motions that do not quite make a track, as if fabric had spoken with grit, and both had agreed to keep the conversation to themselves. I set the pole, tied the cloth, and lifted it into the shiver at the crest. It snapped once in the wind that should have been at my back, and then hung as if it were considering a different weather entirely. I let the pole sway and listened with the patience a medic keeps for a pulse that wants to disappear. The basin held its breath long enough to make me count, and somewhere beyond the curve there was the faintest knock. Too steady to be random, too thin to be anything but a message, landing out of time with the gusts that touched my face. I said the name again, told them what I heard, told them I would mark the place and not chase the sound yet. I planted a stake and pressed my palm flat to the sand. Under the surface lay a cool line that did not run in the direction of the wind. I took my hand away and watched the grains tremble. Not from my breath, not from my weight, but from something reading the ledger back to me. I packed the flare tube, tightened the straps until the pack felt like a promise, and told the radio I was committing to a slow, careful probe. Then I stepped into the corridor that had started to keep my account. I moved with the patience that keeps a person useful, letting the corridor decide how fast it would give itself over. The flags behind me made a thin, bright spine in the bowl, each one speaking the same quiet sentence. You can come back this way. The wind pressed at my right ear again while the sand streamers along the slope argued left. I let the contradiction live beside me without trying to solve it. Some problems go feral when chased. I marked the cool seam under the surface with a glove depression and tracked its faint run as it slipped off the expected line, a whisper beneath the crest that did not care what the map believed. I crouched to adjust the pack so the frame lay steady against the ribs and slid the rescue pole down until the tip kissed firmer crust. The satphone in its pouch pulsed an easy heartbeat that made no sense. Signal strong where the sky looked empty, weak where the basin opened. I toggled the radio and kept my voice level, passing a position relative to my own flags and the long dune's shoulder, requesting any answering sound that could be held without harm. The reply came not through the speaker, but through the ground, a thread of knock that paced my breath rather than the gusts. I set another stake, pushed it deep until the webbing hummed, and the hum settled into that same late beat I had been hearing since the saddle. The sand offered small truths. In the lee of a low lip, I found a scratch that a boot edge might leave when someone had tried to pivot without committing to a direction. The cut was clean on one side and gnawed on the other, as if wind and indecision had worked it in relay. There was a fragment nearby, a strip of cloth bleached nearly the color of the place, woven tight like agency flagging, but not from any role I carry. It lay with a stubborn angle against the breeze, pointing inland when the surface insisted seaward. I knotted it to my own pole under the bright cloth and lifted both. The two fabrics made different choices. Mine snapped and fell in the rhythm of the gusts. The found piece strained toward the corridor or swore as if the basin pulled at it directly. Heat gathered itself without drama, a slow hand closing. I drank in small sips as I walked, and let the tongue tell me when to stop. The smell shifted from the dry mineral I trust to a brief wash of something like wet rope left in a boathouse. It was wrong for this far in. The Benguela's ghost has range, yes, but not usually with such chosen focus. My altimeter watch held to its pretend certainty while a thin pressure itch tugged at the skin under the band. I loosened it a notch, and the itch receded as if offended at not being believed. I do not like when tools and body tell different stories. The ground ahead glittered in patches, not the bright flash of mica, but a duller glaze that comes when surface sinters under long wind. I tested those patches with the pole and skirted them. They can carry a person and then vanish like a promise. At the base of the slope I saw prints again, the same pairings of light and heavy within a few strides, as if someone had been learning how to carry themselves in the day's heat and never settled on an answer. One impression showed the tread more clearly than it should, sharp for the temperature, edges not sagged. I pressed my hand in beside it and felt the cool seam again, running like a buried braid that the wind could not touch. I whispered the courtesy line and named the color of the cloth on my pole, told the unseen person to hold any motion and breathe for me. The basin gave me the paper hiss and the wrong ear wind. Orders would prefer I back off, work the rim, request another set of hands and eyes, and I would have done that if I had read panic here. What I felt was something else, a ledger being written in a patient hand. I gave the channel an update that would read as conservative and moved along the inside bend where the dune faces leaned together. The passage narrowed until my elbows brushed grit on one side and shadow on the other. Inside that pinch, the air cooled noticeably at ankle height, the sort of pocket I've found along fog lines in the coast hills, but never under a sky like this. I bent and slipped a hand through the air layers, feeling warm above and chilled below, a vertical split as clean as a folded page. The radio crackled, and a syllable arrived late, my own voice reflected in a way that put it behind me. I turned, and the flags in the bowl stood in their line, each one steady, each one telling the same good story of a possible return. No movement among them, yet a part of me counted wrong and could not fix the sum. I took the corridor in short pushes, planting a stake where the knock gathered underfoot, then waiting in a stance that keeps the knees honest and the breathing steady. I kept the satphone pressed against my chest between calls to warm it through the pouch, not trusting the bars but respecting the ritual. When the knock paused, I spoke the name from the call record again and told a story aloud the way we are taught to do with subjects in shock. Where I was, what I would do next, what would happen after that if the place allowed it. It steadied me as much as any unseen listener. The wind tried a new direction for a moment and then gave it up, embarrassed to be caught practicing. The corridor widened into a shallow amphitheater. At the far lip, a ribbon of darker sand marked a trap where lighter grains had been stolen by every small breeze. On that ribbon, half buried, stood a stake the color of agency paint, cap scarred, webbing gnawed. I did not want to see that color here without an entry in the log. I crossed to it carefully, laying flags at closer intervals, and eased the sand away with the pole tip. The shaft had been driven deep and then rocked, not by a human hand, but by oscillation. It had fretted a groove in the crust around it like a metronome losing patience. Beneath the groove, I felt the cool seam again, stronger, running across the amphitheater against the long lines of the wind. I keyed the radio and read out the find, including the color and the position relative to my flag line, asking control to cross-check recent operations. The answer came back delayed by a beat and sanded by that paper hiss. The words were right, but their timing broke faith. I circled the stake and knelt on the lee side where sound collects. The knock gathered and clarified there, not loud, never loud, but steady in a way that required intention. I placed the satphone flat on the sand and watched the signal dance with a confidence it had not earned. I pressed my ear to the surface through the scarf, and the grains ticked like a soft rain from below, a sensation without a cause that the field textbooks do not cover. Smell rose then, not kelp this time, but a fainter hint of hot iron touched with salt, the ghost of a railway cutting daylight at a shore. The sensation of distance collapsed. The basin felt close as a room. I could have pulled the stake and walked it with me, but I left it planted and tied a fresh length of flagging to the cap. I do not like to remove the only sentence a place might be saying. I planted a companion stake a short way off and ran webbing between them at ankle height, a trip line for my own attention, rather than a trap for any living thing. I told the channel I was setting a short circuit of markers and would run a slow grid in the amphitheater before moving on. I also told the truth that the wind's answer and the ground's knock did not agree with any rule I trusted, and that I would adjust the plan to honor that disagreement. Silence held from control long enough for me to doubt the battery. Then the acknowledgement arrived, correct in phrasing, late in rhythm. I began the grid. Step, plant, listen. Step, plant, listen. The rescue pack sat high and the straps whispered with each breath. The cloth on my pole behaved like a creature wondering which way to turn. In the close lee of the far wall, the cool seam lifted toward the surface until my palm dipped into it without digging. My altimeter watch twitched, then settled into a new confidence, as if pressure had decided to write a different number and was proud of the change. I spoke aloud again to the caller, told them I had found a place where the ground spoke more clearly, told them I would remain here for a stretch, and that if they could make even a small change to their profile, a raised arm, a shifted heel, they should hold it until I marked the effect. The knock paused as if considering, and returned with a faint echo that did not belong to this open sky. I sat back on my heels and let the plan widen. We like to think the desert cannot carry echoes the way stone can, but the right shapes will make a liar of a person. I closed my eyes and mapped by sound, tracing the late beat as it bounced through the amphitheater. It wanted to lead me into a narrower pinch beyond the far lip, a place where two faces almost touched. I stood slowly, tightened the pack, checked the flare kit by feel without looking, and breathed until the heart stopped arguing with the day. Orders would want a partner here. The ledger of small truths asked me to test alone, but gently. I told the channel I would approach the pinch and stop at first shade, that I would keep the flag line honest and report on every change. Then I walked toward the place where the ground's cool seam met the wind's wrong answer and listened for the paper hiss to falter. The pinch carried shade like a secret. Two faces leaned toward each other until the sky looked like a narrow river that a person could drink only with the eyes. Heat put its hand on the back of my neck, and the cool seam under the sand climbed to meet it, two temperatures arguing inside the same breath. I stopped at the first sliver of shadow, settled the pack against the wall, and called it in. I would advance one body length at a time, plant flags at ankle height, listen, then move only if the rhythm held. The acknowledgement came with correct wording, and that same delay, as if the voice on the other end were reading from a page a heartbeat behind me. I checked the rescue pole and shortened it so I could probe from a crouch. The satphone bars looked cheerful against the glare, and then, without cause, dimmed to almost nothing. I pressed the unit to the webbing on my chest to warm it, then lifted it again. The screen rallied. Confidence without reason is a dangerous companion. The flare kit felt heavier than it should. Not from weight, but from implication. I told the corridor that I would light another, only if I needed to teach the wind a lesson. The wind answered by brushing the wrong ear and lost interest halfway through the touch. The ground song gathered. It was never urgent. It wanted a listener, not a follower. I sank a stake into the threshold and tied a scrap of bright cloth, then took a breath and moved through the gap. Sound changed in an instant. The paper hiss softened and flattened, and the faint knock slipped forward, so the body confused it for a heartbeat. I let that pass and kept to the method. Probe, plant, lean, listen. I feathered sand aside with the pole tip, just enough to watch how it fell back. In the heart of the pinch, it slid faster toward a shallow groove running crosswise to the wind-cut ripples, as if a hidden hand had laid a level under the dune and was proud of the alignment. Halfway down the throat of the passage, I found a trace that made no sense at first. It was not a footprint, not the scuff of a dragged heel, not the trail of a reptile. It looked like someone had set a coil of thin line on the surface and weighed it down at intervals, then lifted it after a short time so the sand could remember. The marks were regular but not precise, human but not careful. I knelt and held the line in my head, then pressed my palm gently where each curve had rested. The cool seam swam under the skin, brighter where the marks had been, quiet between them. If a person had crossed with rope, the rope had listened to something other than wind. I spoke the name from the call and added a second line I use only when the mind begins to fray. You do not have to speak, you only have to keep being. I told them I was in the throat of the pinch and that I would sit with them if they had chosen stillness. I asked them to imagine a flare they could see, even if none burned. I promised that if they held the thought steady, I would move in a way that respected it. The radio breathed upon my cheek like paper lifted and put down. The satphone blinked its uncertain optimism. My altimeter watch grew suddenly shy and then bold again, as if pressure had told it a joke it didn't quite understand. A ripple of air crawled along the floor at ankle height, cool as a morning in a coastal yard. It moved against the wind I felt on my face. I placed the rescue pole flat on the sand and watched the cloth at its tip. The bright strip lifted at the wrong moment, fell out of sequence, then surged as if the corridor had a private breeze. I set the pole upright and listened to the grainy whisper at the wall. If the desert could make an echo, it would sound like this. Not a repeat, but a remember. The knock returned, patient and late, as though the floor knew the habit of my breathing and wanted to walk beside it. I had promised myself I would not chase sound without visual, so I looked for signs the eyes could love. On the right face, just below shoulder height, there were faint vertical scratches, parallel and shallow, too regular to be wind, too delicate to be the scrape of a pack frame. They ran in a short ladder that climbed toward the pinch and stopped at a small, dark lens in the sand, a patch where grains had melted into an imperfect glass. I brushed it with a knuckle and felt a warmth that did not match the shade. Heat and cool lived in separate rooms here, neighbors who refused to speak. I leaned close and sniffed. The smell carried a hint of hot iron and a trace of kelp again, like the railway ghost had decided to bring a shore into the corridor. That made 3 breadcrumbs before noon. Wrong ear wind, ground knockout of time, and a smell that had no road to get here. Orders like partners and daylight and easy geometry. I had none of those, and I carried responsibility for choosing to be here without them. The ledger of small truths still asked for quiet work done well. I keyed the radio and laid out a plan that would sound dull on the log and felt sharp in the gut. I would set a figure 8 of flags through the throat of the pinch, then run it slowly in both directions to test whether this place remembered the path differently depending on the order. If the ledger kept track, the sand would tell me. The voice in my ear agreed with a pause and a page turn. I walked the pattern with the care of a person tracing a love sentence. On the first loop, the cloth on my pole chose one rhythm. On the return, it hesitated at the same spot where the coil marks had been. I stopped there and pressed a palm flat. The cool seam answered brightly, and the knock deepened to something close to a beat you could count if count were allowed. My tongue found the taste of metal at the back of the throat. I swallowed and told the unseen person that I would stay anchored here for a stretch and become predictable. Sometimes the most generous thing you can give a place is your own routine. I slid the pack off, sat with my back to the wall, and made a small ritual of checking gear. Sand stakes rattled a confident language in the side sleeve. The flare kit whispered against the fabric, like a matchbook searching for a pocket. The satphone made a brief show of capability and then a modest sulk. I cracked a cap just enough to smell the propellant, and then closed it again. I pulled a wrap from the pack and tucked my neck, not for warmth, but to give the body a task it could finish. I listened. The knock timed itself to the pulse and then slipped one breath ahead, a teasing step. The paper hiss faded, returned, faded again. I could almost feel the corridor lean, as if curious. I spoke log lines aloud so they would belong to the day. Baseline established. Corridor pinch exhibits layered flow. Warm at face, cool at ankles. Ground seam persists, oriented against prevailing. Found coil trace, likely line contact. Regular, imperfect. Agency-colored stake earlier within basin. Oscillation groove present. Scent anomalies repeated. Kelp at distance, iron near. Acoustic signature, knock steady, late to wind. Echo-like behavior within throat. Communications delayed in rhythm, but accurate in phrase. Satphone confidence inconsistent with sky. Altimeter watch, resisting pressure narrative. Actions planned. Maintain figure 8. Test bidirectional memory. Conserve flares. No blind chase. The voice I had called for remained human in absence. There is a point in every scene where rescue becomes search, becomes witness. I did not want to cross that border, not yet. I rolled the pole between my palms to feel for vibration, and the webbing between the stakes thrummed slightly without being touched by wind. The tune rode the cool seam like a wire in a wall. I tapped my gloved finger on the sand in a slow pattern, and the knock copied it with one extra beat after the end. That was new, not a mimic, an answer. I did it again, shorter. Again, the extra beat after. I tried once more, and the pattern returned as before, unchanged in its addition. A signature rather than a conversation. The corridor mouth flashed with heat and then calmed. For a moment, the flags in the bowl shimmered into doubles, each bright spine mirrored by a ghost. I blinked and they fused. I counted them quietly and stopped before the last so that the mind would not make mischief. It is one thing to lose a step in storm or fog. To lose one in clear air is worse. I clipped the satphone to the shoulder strap, where I could see it without lifting my hands, and told control I was holding at the throat, that a patterned response seemed possible, that I would not declare it as language. I said the situation remained safe for one, with caveats. The reply took longer than any previous, and then arrived with impeccable punctuation. The pause mattered more than the words. I stood and walked the figure 8 again, slow enough to feel each grain shift under my soles. At the crossing point I stopped and closed my eyes. The knock leaned close as if to smell me. I tapped the pattern once more. The extra beat followed, soft as a fingertip on paper. I said the name I had been carrying and told them I heard them. The wind found my wrong ear and held it. The smell of iron lifted and thinned. Somewhere behind me, a flag felt persuaded to flutter and then changed its mind. I breathed in and said I would stay until the heat changed, that I would not push the throat without a sign I could touch. The corridor agreed with silence. The ledger added a bright underline I could feel in the palm against the sand. The figure 8 waited for my next pass like a patient sentence without a period. I waited until the heat settled into its steady cruelty, then stood and let the body remember how to move without wasting a gram. The figure 8 on the throat of the corridor lay faintly drawn in the sand like a patient instruction. I told control I would test a longer line deeper into the pinch and return to the crossing before the light pushed the day toward foolishness. The acknowledgement came as always, the right words landing a beat behind the moment that needed them. My pole felt tuned to the floor. When I tilted it, the webbing between the stakes quivered without wind as if the ground had learned to sing on its own. The smell of iron thinned until only imagination could keep it. In its place rose a faint sweetness that reminded me of damp paper warmed by a sun through glass. Wrong for this place and hour. The satphone danced between pride and sulk, bars lifting and falling with no good reason. I clipped it where my chest could keep it warm and set out, tracing the seam I had learned with my palm, stepping so lightly that my prints looked undecided about being mine. The cloth on my pole hesitated before each turn, and then chose the wind that touched the wrong ear. I talked aloud to the absent caller, telling them I was moving 2 breaths forward, then stopping for 3, a metered pace to teach the corridor who I was. The passage opened into a second bowl narrower than the first, with a lip shaped like the edge of a page turned part way and left. On that lip lay a scatter of pale grains that did not belong to the dune's usual palette, a dust the color of bone planed thin. The rescue pole tip found crust beneath them, a firmer plane than the surrounding slope, as if heat had licked this margin longer than it had any right to. I worked around it and came to a hollow where the cool seam rose until it kissed the skin through the glove. Here the knock stood closer, never a drum, only a patient fingertip tapping out its habit. I gave the channel the position relative to my own flags, then listened. The reply reached me with a small rustle that was not static, like a sleeve across paper. After it, a softer sound entirely, one that did not pass through the radio. It was the clip of a carabiner touched to metal, the tiny note it makes when a climber clears ice from a gate by reflex. I know that sound. It lives in the hand. There was no ice, no gate, no partner beside me. The desert delivered it anyway, from a direction the wind did not explain. I tasted old fear and then set it down where fear belongs, next to respect but not in charge. I spoke the command voice I used to steady teams and heard it come back one breath late. The echo had begun to wear my patience. Two thin grooves ran along the hollow, parallel and shallow, like the tracks a narrow sled might leave if someone pulled it across sand packed just enough to forgive the effort. I knelt at their crossing and pressed, and the seam answered brighter. The grooves converged at a darker patch where grains had fused again into tremulous glass. Heat lived in that small round lens, and nowhere else. I smelt for kelp, and found only a hint. Then the scent went to ground like an animal tired of being followed. The satphone chose that moment to produce a tone I had not asked for, a clean little rise that means an incoming connection. Its screen showed the kind of message that is always too simple, a call with no number. I lifted the unit and said the name from the record. The voice that returned was mine, half a breath behind. I listened until the tiny lag turned the sound uncanny, then killed the call and pushed the phone back under the webbing, where the ribcan reminded of its duty. Orders sat in my head like a folded letter. They ask for clarity and the courage to step back when clarity has not arrived. The ledger of small truths asked for a different courage. Hold your place, become repeatable, invite the thing that does not wish to be named to make its pattern more legible. I compromised. I would not go blind into any third chamber. I would build a line back to the mouth and strengthen the spine I had laid across the first bowl. I tucked fresh flagging into the top flap for quicker hands and began to seed the return with more color, setting stakes deep where the knock resonated longest. Each time I planted one, the webbing picked up a faint hum and held it until my body stilled, as if the corridor preferred me quiet. Halfway through the work, I looked back across the first bowl and found my flags steady as soldiers, but the line they traced felt one step too short for the ground it spanned. I had marked them at even intervals by stride and breath. Now the space between two nearest the truck seemed a little lean, as if an unkind editor had cut a word and hoped I would not notice. I counted without numbers, this many to the saddle, that many to the truck, a known rhythm, and the count satisfied the ear but not the feet. Maps can shrink when the mind does, but I was not yet small. I set a fresh stake between the pair and tamped it firm, claiming the space with a spoken line. This belongs to the walk home. I returned to the second bowl and lit a flare low in the lee to teach the wind its place. Smoke lifted, tried seaward, faltered, then poured along the ground toward the pinch as if gravity had rolled a new way. I crouched and watched it move through the figure eight, snagging at the crossing point, thickening where the coil marks had been, thinning where the hidden seams seemed deepest. The flare hiss wrote itself into the corridor's larger hiss until everything spoke paper. I told myself that heat bends air in all sorts of reasonable ways. I knew I was lying a little, and I promised the person I had come for that I would not build my courage on lies. While the flare spent itself, I cleared a small patch of surface with the edge of my glove and pressed the altimeter watch face down, then lifted it and checked the changed mood of its needle. It had swung farther than the gossip of the sky warranted and held there with pride. Pressure stories are messy in this land, but the watch had taken a position and was ready to argue for it. I let it. Even the lies of a tool can be useful if they are consistent. The radio murmured with the low room tone again, and, over it, the faintest thread of human breath. I said the name, and the breath did not change pace. I asked for a small motion, and the knock answered with its extra beat after mine, unchanged, as if the corridor had written that beat into itself and would not forget. A bird cut the line of sky above the pinch, the same high traveler or another of its kind. It banked once and flattened, a scrap of life that refused to take position in any ledger. I watched it too long and felt the place press an impatient palm against the small of my back. It wanted me either deeper or gone. It did not care which. I packed the spent flare tube, tightened the straps until the pack became part of how I stood, and placed my palm to the ground one last time. The seam ran true, cool and insistent, crosswise to the wind, unchanged by the display of smoke. Whatever wrote it did not take instructions from the sky. I addressed the corridor as if it were a person in shock. I am leaving 2 breaths and returning 3. I will walk the figure 8 twice. I will test the lip again. I will speak your name and keep my voice clean. I told Control I would widen the search pattern across the second bowl and then withdraw to the truck for water and a line check unless the ledger argued for staying. The answer came late and perfect in language, a polished reply flensed of any personality. I preferred their usual clipped gratitude. Perfection felt like mimicry from something that did not love the craft. I took one more step toward the far lip, only to the shadow, only to prove a rule true or false. The cloth on my pole stiffened against a breeze I did not feel on the face. The webbing between two stakes rasped as if touched by a careful hand. The satphone on my strap lit itself without tone and showed connection where there should have been none, then politely dimmed. From the lip came the precise sound of a rescue pack's zipper, worked a small distance, and then stopped. It was not my pack. It was a motion made by someone taught to pause, listen, and close again if attention gathered. I did not move. I let air choose my lungs and leave of its own accord. The knock came once more, then the extra beat after, a signature dropping a flourish at the end of its name. I said aloud that I would not chase a zipper into shade. I said the person's name and the promise behind it. Then I planted another stake at my toe, bright cloth snapping once as if it had understood, and began to lay the path back out of the pinch so that whatever stayed inside would not own my return. Backing out of the pinch took more nerve than threading it. The figure eight waited like a reasonable path, but my feet had learned something about the place that reason could not hold steady. I spoke aloud to the corridor the way I would to a subject I did not want to startle. I am leaving one room to check the door. I will return if the door remembers me. The cloth on my pole gave a small shake that did not belong to the wind at my face. I planted another stake at the threshold and let my palms read the seam one last time. It ran bright and cool across the grain, unchanged by my promise. The second bowl threw heat back at me as I crossed it, and the feeling of being watched moved from neck to ankles as if the cool layer had slid forward to inspect my steps. At the lip where grains had fused to a tremulous lens, I paused. The little pane held a warmth that ignored the shade. I let a breath touch it and watched haze smear across its surface and vanish. I gave the channel my intent to widen the flags and withdraw for water, rest, and cross-check, then listen for the pause that had become an unwanted companion. It came, polite and late, followed by the acknowledgement in perfect words that hardly sounded like my people. The delay worked under the skin like a splinter. Beyond the pinch, the first bowl looked honest again, flags standing with their bright sentence, struck a small rectangular promise at the far rim. Still, the count in my head felt one breath off. The stride between two stakes stretched thin the way a long story loses a scene. I added a new flag there, speaking its purpose as I tamped it down, and the correction clicked into place for the eyes, even if the feet held doubts. The satphone, snug against the webbing, lifted its bars and lowered them, as if adding its own opinion about distance. I told it gently that it had one job, and it could do that without dramatics. At the basin floor, a tongue of wind found the wrong ear again, cooler than it should have been for the hour. I crouched and trailed my gloved fingers just above the surface. Air slid past them toward the pinch, while the slope streamers above still ran seaward. Two motions, two stories. I marked the spot with a stake and ran a short length of webbing to its neighbor, a low line at ankle height that sang softly when the ground knock thickened. The sound was not a tone so much as a patience I could almost taste. I tapped the sand with one finger in the slow pattern that had earned me the extra beat, then stopped. It arrived as before, one more tap after mine, soft as the end of a sentence spoken to a sleepy room. Halfway to the truck, the day shifted from heat to a light so bright that shadows seemed carved into things. My own shape on the sand looked too sharp at the edges, as if cut out and laid over the place. I glanced down and found a strip of cloth caught under my boot print. Not mine. Woven tight like agency flagging, but the dye bled toward the color of bone. I lifted it. It carried the faint odor of warmed paper. I tied it to the pole under my own bright strip, and the two disagreed again over which way to lean. Mine obedient to the face wind, the found piece tugging toward the corridor as if the basin command belonged there. At the truck I let the cab's shade turn my head cool, and kept every motion deliberate so the mind would follow the body's lead. Water, slow sips, the pause that lets it find the places it needs. I set the satphone on the dash and watched it prepare to perform. It rolled bars like a gambler's hands and then settled into a neat picture of full strength. The sky above showed no cause for charity. I tried the call chain and reached a recorded courtesy that did not belong to us, the kind of automated greeting that lives in other offices and never in a rig like mine. When I killed the attempt, the handset stayed lit as if still connected to some quiet. In the glass of the windshield, I saw my own face doubled, one with the scarf pulled down, one with it up. A stutter of identity in the reflection that lasted a breath and then chose. I looked away because attention feeds the wrong things. I checked the flare kit by touch, counting without numbers, and discovered that somewhere between the figure 8 and the truck, a tube had left the world of my keeping. The case knot my hands tie without thinking had loosened itself and settled again, arrogant and tidy, and I did not like that at all. I told the loss to the log in a voice meant to be heard later by someone who does not trust either of us. One flare unaccounted for, last seen at the throat. Odds poor it walked on its own. The altimeter watch woke to my mutter and chose a new story about pressure with sudden conviction. I let it talk while I ate something that did not ask for thought. I stepped around the truck to check the tire faces for scouring and found a small drift packed hard against the downwind side that had no business being that firm so early. Pressing a glove to it gave me the same chill I had been palming under the sand in the corridor. The truck had grown its own seam. I made myself laugh at that, a dry little sound that tasted like grit. I scraped the drift clear and set 2 flags near the bumper so the return would look like a sure thing. The flags fluttered in the same direction as the cloth on my pole for a blink and then parted ways, one answering the honest breeze, the other bowing toward the bowl that had learned to keep account. I told Control I would run a short return to the second bowl to confirm stability and then decide whether to call a partner or keep the ledger myself until evening. The reply came with all the right syllables and the wrong soul. I preferred the clipped impatience of the person I knew at the other end of the duty line. This felt like a voiced procedure, recited by something that enjoyed being correct. I checked the rescue pack, took only what I needed to be quick, and left the rest in the cab with a promise I meant to keep. Back fast, back whole. The basin had shifted its tone. I felt it first in the soles, a slow resonance that greeted each step half a breath after my foot left the sand. The webbing between the new stakes I'd set at the floor hummed without visible wind, a thin thread under the ear's threshold that the bones took up willingly. I walked to the figure 8 and found it intact, lines faint but true. At the crossing point, the cool seam rose close enough that a bent knee could feel it. I tapped the sand once and waited for the extra beat. It came, but earlier than it should have, impatient now, arriving just before my own second tap began. I let my hand go still. The knock stilled with it. I exhaled through clenched teeth, not in anger, in discipline. Things that learn your rhythm deserve respect and distance. At the lip of the second bowl, the scrap of bone-colored dust lifted, as if a hand had stirred it from below. It climbed in a small plume, and then spilled toward the pinch like talc poured into a funnel. I lit a flare low, not for show, for proof, and watched the smoke lift, circle once as if testing loyalty, then choose the same path the dust had taken, along the floor, upslope to the throat, inside the figure 8, thickening exactly where those old coil marks had slept. The color ran like a ribbon through the hollow and into the shade. When the wind touched my face, it arrived late to its own event. The zipper sound came again, close to the lip but not on it, a short motion followed by the soft pause of a gloved hand listening. I said the name I had been carrying since the first call and laid out the immediate plan in the voice that keeps ordinary fear from painting the day. I will not enter the third room. I will hold here. I will mark the place. If you can move without harm, make a small change and hold it. If not, breathe as if I were counting for you. The radio gave me the paper hiss, and then, very faint, a breath that might have been mine played back to me from an earlier hour. I could have chased that recording into whatever waited in the deeper shade. I kept my promise to myself and did not. I planted 2 more stakes at the hollow and ran webbing between them to build a low harp the corridor could play if it wished. The strands quivered without wind, a plucked line under the skin. I spoke the pattern again with a gloved finger, and the extra beat did not follow. Instead, the webbing hummed in a slow rise and held, like a held note asking for a chorus. My altimeter watch picked that moment to swing boldly toward a new conviction and then hold there with the stubborn joy of a bad idea. I smiled, which is how a person keeps from feeding the wrong ledger. Walking out toward the truck, the flags stood properly one after the other. No doubled ghosts, no edited spaces. Still, the distance felt longer in the lungs and shorter in the legs, a computation that leaves the brain unsatisfied. At the cab, the strange drift had returned at the downwind tire, taller now and colder under the palm. I brushed it back with a stake, and the metal sang against grains that had no right to be that hard. I set the pole across the bed and leaned in. The cab smelled faintly of warmed paper again, a scent no vehicle should wear. The satphone had decided I had missed a call and displayed an empty history of it, a blank entry like an unsigned letter. I did not touch it. I drank water in small obedience and let the body speak gratitude. I wrote the logline on my own tongue before I would ever write it in any book. I am changed. Not in the drama that agencies fear and paperwork forbids, but in the more ordinary way a place edits a person's rules. The corridor had asked for a rhythm and found mine. The ground had learned to knock at a time of its choosing. The wind had taught my ear new directions. If I stayed until dark, I would hear my own voice say things back to me with perfect language and wrong timing. I folded the thought like a map, slid it into a pocket where it could weigh down the day, and told Control I would hold at the truck and rethink the next push with the sun lower and the heat leaving. The reply arrived late and splendid, as if proud to be clear. It left me lonelier than a silence would have. I closed my eyes and let the breeze choose a path across my peak. It touched the wrong ear, then the right, then neither, as if some hand had cupped the air and moved it through the day with care. I opened them and saw one new thing. A single bright scrap, not mine, standing at the mouth of the corridor, not planted, lodged in the sand like an invitation. I had left none loose. I did not move toward it. I let it stand there and tell me what it wanted. The ledger could write one more line without my help. I would pay for that patience later. For the moment, it was the only clean currency I had. I let the bright scrap stand at the mouth while I sat in the cab and rebuilt the afternoon into something I could carry back inside the wind. The rescue pack waited open on the seat, straps tidy. Nothing missing now, except the one flare that had walked out of my care. I did not touch the sat phone. It glowed like a small aquarium full of calm fish, and I wanted none of that calm. I drank water until it tasted like water again. When I stepped down, the drift against the downwind tire had crept back, colder than shade, and packed like frost without the courtesy of moisture. I cleared it with a stake, and the metal gave a soft, annoyed ring. The scrap at the corridor's mouth had not moved. It stood as if it had been told to wait for a signal I was too cautious to give. I walked toward it along my flags, not to accept the invitation, only to see how the air behaved when I made up my mind slowly. Halfway there, the wrong ear breeze found me again, cooler than the face wind and too deliberate for a desert afternoon. At ankle height, a second motion slipped inland, a silk thread under the coarse push. The webbing between the floor stakes hummed without hurry. My altimeter watch tightened its resolve about pressure and then loosened it, like a hand that remembered grief and let it go again. I crouched near the scrap and saw fibers that had slept in weather longer than any roll of mine would allow, edges abraded into a soft fringe that held grain dust as if it were ink. I spoke the courtesy line, named the color, told the air where I was, told the person inside all this that I would not break my promise to hold at thresholds. The radio gave me the paper hiss and a breath that could have been mine. No words, no panic. I reached with the pole and pinned the scrap without moving it, just to feel if the ground answered. The knock rose from the floor as if happy to be noticed, and the pole shaft thrummed like wire inside a wall. I withdrew and let the cloth be. The first bowl kept its good face, flags honest in their row, the truck steady at the rim. Still, the count between two stakes felt wrong again. A long pause in a short sentence. I did not correct it. If the ledger wanted to edit, I wanted to see how it would write the next line. I left the pole planted for a moment and walked a small circuit with empty hands, letting the body listen for load without the reassurance of a tool. The cool seam under the floor followed anyway, close to the skin, an obedient dog that had learned my pace. I told the corridor I would come back to the figure 8 and hold there at last light to learn how the wind wrote evening. The cloth at the mouth lifted once and fell, like a hand waved from a far window. Back within the pinch, the shade ran deeper and the sweet warmed paper smell returned, delicate as if the day had learned manners. The figure 8 still lay in the throat, its crossings faint but coherent, and the harp I had strung at the hollow answered my step with a restful hum. I tested the extra beat by tapping the sand with a glove, and the corridor answered, not after me but with me, a twin moving beside instead of behind. That change put heat between my shoulder blades despite the cool at my ankles. I stood and spoke a rescue rhythm aloud, the one that turns breath and count into a steadying rope. In, hold, out, hold. The hum adjusted to match the holds, not the breaths. The place was past echo now. It had become a kind of metronome that set its own tempo and asked me to play along. I promised the unseen person that I would not follow that invitation without a cost I understood. The zipper sound came once, not from the third chamber, but from somewhere above. A careful inching of a gate on a pack lid, then the pause of listening. My hand went to my own zipper by reflex. It was closed and sand-scabbed. I set the rescue pack down and moved my fingers across each tab without looking, letting muscle memory check what the eyes might lie about. Everything stayed honest. The sound had been for me, not from me. At the figure 8 crossing, I knelt and pressed my palm. The seam ran stronger now, almost a draft, the cool climbing through the glove to rest in the bones of the hand. I set a stake by feel and tied a short ribbon of flagging so it would flutter at knee height, low enough to escape the higher wind's command, high enough to show any private breath sliding along the floor. The ribbon stirred against the wrong ear current, then stilled. The radio coughed up the duty voice, words crisp and eager to be proper, telling me what I had already told myself about partners and holding and the wisdom of patience. The lag between my call and their reply edged longer. Perfection in language began to sound like a joke told too often. I lit a flare not to teach the wind, but to mark a contract. I placed it low where the cool rose and watched the smoke choose the figure 8, snag at the crossing, then trail toward the second bowl, as if the corridor had learned a route and would prefer I learn it the same way. The color ran behind a fold of shadow and thinned into invisibility, even as the hiss continued. When it burned to a nub, I palmed the floor again and felt the seam purl like water against a pier. The satphone on my strap buzzed without sound, a haptic insistence from an old world, and its screen bloomed with another blank call. I let it bloom and die without touching it. We are taught that a desert keeps poor records. The Namib writes its day in loose sand, and then shakes the page clean by night. This place had decided otherwise. My footprints from earlier had sharpened in spots that should have sagged, and softened where heat should have cut them hard. A loop I had walked twice now lay with an extra elbow as if an editor had tucked a clause into the sentence. The harp lines quivered to my heartbeat, not to the air. I told the corridor that I saw what it was doing, and that I could respect care without obeying it. Then I tested the one rule I was still allowed to break. I stood very still, long enough to let the body forget it was a thing that moves, and I listened for what the place did when I gave it nothing. Breath by breath, the wrong ear breeze faded, then resumed from the same side as if it had run an errand and returned. The knock retreated until it was only a suggestion in the bones. The sweetness in the air thinned to almost nothing, and the corridor gave me pure quiet for the first time since morning. In that quiet, a single grain ticked down the wall and made more of a sound than it should have, and the scrap at the mouth lifted, as though somewhere far outside a hand had opened and closed. I said the name I had been carrying, and told it to do nothing on purpose. I said I would not ask again until the sun touched the rim. The corridor kept my promise better than I did. The light tilted, not into gold, into a flatter brightness that makes faces unreadable. Evening comes oddly here. Shadow grows up from the ground as much as down from the sky. I made a last walk of the figure 8, and felt the crossing raise under my soul, as if the sand had learned to hold weight without collapsing. The harp gave one long note and fell quiet. A breath brushed both ears at once, a cupped motion without source. From the second bowl came the rustle of webbing under strain, and the gentle knock of a carabiner touched once, the reflex of a partner who has learned to listen. My throat closed for a moment at the memory it offered. I opened it with the ritual a trainer had taught me. Say what the hands are doing and why. Hands steady, flare kit closed, pack settled. I am staying. It worked. The body obeyed. I told Control I would hold through the first edge of dark and then withdraw. I said I would leave a marked line and a clear ledger, request a second team at first light, return with the day's map of the corridor's choices. What came back was a calm I do not know in the voices we use out here, as if a textbook had found a tongue and liked the job. It asked me to repeat my last sentence in a tone so gentle that for a heartbeat I almost did. Then the radio added a soft sheet shift. The paper hiss rolled, and the kindness turned thin as cellophane. I signed off without courtesy, and the channel stayed open a blink too long, catching my breath and giving it back to me. At the mouth, the bone-colored scrap had moved a finger's width toward my line. No wind pushed it. It had chosen. I picked it up and considered pocketing it, then tied it instead to the last stake before the corridor, a small flag that faced no breeze at all and still lifted when the wrong ear current touched my cheek. I pressed my palm to the floor one final time. The seam ran steady and sure across the wind's story. It belonged to something that had made this geometry its home. That understanding did not ask me to like it. It asked me to stand up and own the cost of walking away before the place owned my return. I stood. I turned my back on the figure 8 and the harp and the zipper sound that would come if I invited it. I let the flags lead me out while the count in my legs disagreed with the distance in my chest. Between the penultimate stakes, the pause had lengthened again. So, I spoke to the gap like a person talks to a dog that has taken up a position on the path. I told it I saw it, and it could keep the space. I promised it I would arrive anyway. The truck waited, drift politely absent, cab smelling like itself at last. I set the rescue pole across the bed and closed the door with care. Sand sizzled down the glass like a handful of salt, thrown from somewhere thoughtful. The satphone displayed another empty call, and then emptied itself of light. I looked once more toward the corridor. The small flag I had left at its mouth stood out straight, pointing into the throat like a knowing finger. The wrong ear breeze touched the back of my neck as if to say the word now. I did not move. I kept my vow to leave before dark. I drove the short distance to the hard pan and turned the engine off to listen. The wind answered from every direction and none, and then, very far, I heard the extra beat. One more tap after mine, arrived from the sand the way a memory arrives from a body. Late, exact, unwilling to quit. I said the name again into the cab's quiet and gave the corridor my last promise of the day. I would return with help and with patience, and I would not let the ledger spend me without purchase. First light wore a thin shore along the desert, a ribbon of fog that did not belong and would not stay. I met the second unit at the hard pan while the world decided whether to be cool or cruel. We spoke the ritual that keeps us honest about risk, simple and aloud. One person leads flags, one person keeps the spine, one person watches the sky and our backs. I kept the lead because the corridor had learned my breath. The others answered with the kind of silence that means yes, but says be careful. Control's voice blessed us in perfect grammar that made nobody feel better. We walked down on a line that had been bright yesterday and looked reluctant now. The flags stood where I had left them, except for two near the mouth that had closed a gap the length of a doubt. I did not fix them. The second bowl held its heat inside the cold of dawn, like a secret in a pocket. At ankle height, the cool seam ran already, disloyal to the time of day. The wrong ear breeze found me and then found the teammate behind me, who frowned and touched the opposite side of his head. That told me the place had learned more than one rhythm overnight. We halted at the figure 8 I had drawn in the throat. The lines lay faint but intact. I described what the corridor does when it feels seen. The extra beat after any pattern. The zipper sound, followed by listening. The harp hum without wind. The teammate who kept our spine ran his gloved fingers along the webbing between my stakes. It quivered as if someone had whispered, "Do that again." He looked at me without blinking. The look that asks whether we intended to bring the ocean to the desert and forgot to mention it. I put my palm to the floor and felt the draft come up through the glove. The cool carried a sweetness that had nothing to do with this sand. The smell of warmed paper rose and went shy. We did what we do when a place insists on poor manners. We slowed our work until routine filled the day, the way water fills a vessel. Low voices, clear sentences, plenty of pauses. We set a fresh harp across the hollow, and it played itself, a modest line that kept to the pulse unless one of us tried to lead it. The satphone rode in my webbing and stayed politely dark. I trusted it more that way. The altimeter watch decided on a pressure story that pleased it and held there, faithful as a metronome that will not learn a new song. I told the channel that we were holding at the throat, that the seam was strong, and the wind's answers were wrong on both ears now, that the corridor behaved as if it kept its own ledger of movements and edits them in the night. Correct language came back, exactly delayed, with the small rustle of paper for punctuation. We probed for the call that had started all this. We called the name the right way and the wrong way, and the way that leaves room for a person to come back from wherever fear parked them. The corridor answered with its habit and its courtesy, and nothing that would let a rescuer write the word found. At the second bowl, the pale dust lifted as if stirred from below and spilled toward the pinch. It was easy to imagine footprints in that spill. It was wrong to write them in our heads. We chose not to. I sent the spinekeeper to the mouth with a slow count and a clean rope. He walked until the flags near the truck stood as bright as yesterday's hope, and then stopped. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. Some distances feel like debts. I stayed with the figure 8 and made myself predictable. The partner at my shoulder placed a palm near mine. When I tapped the sand with one finger, the extra beat arrived after me as before. When he tapped, nothing answered until he lifted his hand, and then the beat came late to him, as if it had to find his rhythm through me. He said nothing. We understand too well the trouble made by naming a thing in front of it. The zipper sound visited us once, no more than the length of a thought, followed by the pause of a trained hand. The partner flinched and then pretended he had not. I said the name we carried and made the promise required by our craft. We would not leave a person for the geometry of a dune. I lit a flare low and let the smoke show us what we already knew. The floor flowed toward the throat and up into the shade along the coil marks that had slept under yesterday's heat. The smoke thickened at the crossing, thinned where the seam dove, hesitated at the mouth of the third room, and vanished as if a door had closed. We let it end without chasing it. Orders live in the space between caution and time. The sun rose and the cool seam did not surrender. The wrong ear wind grew polite, almost domestic, as if it had learned our names and liked us. The ledger wrote a line I could not ignore. The bright scrap at the mouth of the corridor had crept another finger's width toward our path, though no breeze touched it, and a gap on the spine closed without our hands. That is when a rescuer decides whether to pay with bravado or with patience. We chose patience and swung the work outward, mapping every honest thing the place would admit. No boot prints beyond ours, no fresh cloth that we had not brought. A stake with old agency paint fretted in its socket by a long oscillation and set into cool ground against the story the wind told. We closed the search politely. It felt like folding a letter we had not finished. The report we spoke into the day had the parts control specs. Unanswered initial call, corridor exhibiting echo-like behavior, layered flow against prevailing, acoustic pattern repeatable but not verbal, evidence of past work but no confirmed subject, conditions unsafe for deeper push with 2, recommendation for a season change and a larger team. The perfect voice answered late and blessed the plan we were already following. My partner stared at the radio as if willing it to clear its throat and become someone we knew. It did not. The cost came due in small tenders, the careful way a place exacts its due. At the truck, the strange drift against the downwind tire had returned and held cold under the palm despite the hour. The cab smelled briefly of warmed paper and then of nothing. The satphone displayed a blank call history again and then remembered only the numbers it was allowed. When we broke the flag line, the space between the last pairs adjusted itself while we watched, not by much, just enough to make an honest person lie to their own eyes. My partner lifted one of the bone-tinted strips and shook it. It did not answer the wind he offered. It answered the corridor and pointed in. We left anyway. We are good at leaving when the ledger says enough. The drive to Hardpan took longer than the math, shorter than the lungs, the kind of distance that makes a person joke about time thinking it's a dune. We did not joke. At the edge of radio range, Control's voice became itself again, clipped, impatient, almost kind. We looked at each other and did not say what we both knew. It had been a voice all along. It had not always belonged to our side of the air. We filed what we could with the respect a blank deserves. Back at base, I wrote the part of the log that matters to people who weren't there. Facts clean of superstition, caution edged with humility, the admission that we had failed to put a body in the cab, and a name on the line. I wrote the line that matters to me in a place the paperwork will never see. The corridor learned my rhythm, and I let it. The wind learned to answer the wrong ear, and I listened. I can still hear the extra beat after mine when the day goes quiet. It arrives late and exact and will not quit. The cost keeps paying itself. In the locker room, the air sometimes smells faintly of warmed paper when no sun has touched the glass. My altimeter watch sits on the shelf and ticks a story about pressure that stays loyal to a seam under the floor of a desert far away. In crowded hallways, the breeze will touch the ear that faces no door. I speak the names of the living the way I was taught, clear and steady, and once in a while a zipper sound answers from behind me, a careful inch and a pause. I do not turn quickly. I speak the courtesy line and tell it I am here. The habit keeps me from taking the corridor into places where it would do harm. I keep one of the bone-colored scraps tied to the rescue pole, low, where only thin air can touch it. When the wind in other lands behaves, the scrap rests like any cloth. When the air in a room decides to move without cause, it lifts and points toward a door that is not in the wall. I have learned to breathe around that. The map of the Namib on the office wall has a crease at the place where the figure 8 lives. The crease is in the paper, not in the land. That is how a person survives, with care for the small wrinkles a place leaves in them, and a promise not to iron them flat. If the call returns, and that is a kind of mercy I would not ask for, I will bring more hands and a kinder stubbornness. I will say the name and mean it. I will set the harp and let it sing, and I will leave before dark again if the ledger asks. I walked out, and I am at my desk, and the wind answers wrong in rooms that have never seen sand. That is the cost I keep. It is not ruin, it is a rhythm. I breathe with it. I work. When the extra beat arrives at the end of any pattern I tap, I do not chase it. I let it close the sentence and I go home while the day still knows my name.